Hello, my dear students. Welcome to the next class of psychoanalysis. Today we are going to study about Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst. We are going to study about the mirror stage, the psychic structure, the three orders, real, imaginary, and the symbolic. Let's get started. Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, was born in 1901. He was a psychiatrist. He is known as the most controversial psychoanalyst since Freud. He is known for his yearly seminars, and he gave his yearly seminars in Paris from 1953 to 1981. Almost 26 seminars he gave. He took up and discussed Freudian concepts. Concepts of Freud was the basis of his study. He used concepts derived from structuralism also. He used structuralist ideas in psychoanalysis. And he introduced some of his controversial innovations in clinical practice. And he was expelled from IPA, International Psychoanalytical Association. In 1951, at that time, there were many revisions in psychoanalysis. Many contemporary revisions were there in psychoanalysis. And Lacan criticized all those contemporary revisions in psychoanalysis, and he exhorted a return to Freud. That means a return to Freudian concepts or a close reading of Freud's text. Eckert's, his major work, was published in the year 1966, and it was his only book published in his lifetime. Eckert's English translation came in 1977, and along with Eckert's, the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, these works were highly influential for feminist and post-structuralist. Freud, I told you, he took Freudian concepts. He exhorted a return to Freud. Freud gave centrality to ego in self-determination. We have studied id, ego, superego. Ego is the conscious mind, deals with the reality, and Freud gave centrality to ego in determining ourselves. Ego resolves the conflict between id and superego. Id for needs and superego, morality, moral values. And Freud looked into how subconscious is subordinated to conscious mind. Conscious mind is the major one, and subconscious is subordinated to conscious mind as per Freud. But to Lacan, ego doesn't take the central position. He didn't give centrality to ego. Instead, Lacan gave importance to the notion of structure of unconscious. He gave importance to unconscious. He considered unconscious as the nucleus of our being. Unconscious has a major role in our psyche. Unconscious determines our behavior. Unconscious has a major role. And Lacan looked into how the unconscious creates the I, the conscious mind. How the subconscious or how the unconscious creates ourself. Lacan gave importance to this. How the I is created by the subconscious. That was his major quest. How the I is created by the subconscious. And he gave importance, or he studied the structure of unconscious. And he said that, or a central idea was that unconscious is structured like a language. Language got a structure. And his idea was that unconscious is also structured like a language. Language is the route to unconscious. Unconscious is to be understood as intimately tied to the functions of language. And he says unconscious is structured like a language in the essay, The Insistence of the Letter in the Unconscious. And he says that unconscious is not that primitive that to be pushed beyond conscious mind, which doesn't have any role. It is not to be pushed beyond like that. But unconscious is very complex and it is undergoing a transformation, or it is continually formed. Unconscious is the site of signification. Freud's idea was that unconscious can be studied through the slips of tongue or through the dreams. Unconscious can be studied. But as per Lacan, unconscious is situated in inter-subject relation with the other. Unconscious is not that primitive. Language is the route to unconscious. You can study unconscious through language. As language meaning, structuralist notion that we get meaning out of difference. Unconscious is also based on a structure of difference. Now we are moving into the psychic structure. Lacan constructs a model of identity formation that takes a three-stage process. We are going to see the three-stage process, three realms of mind: the real, the imaginary, the symbolic. And he constructs a model of identity formation, and it takes a three-stage process. These are the three stages we are going to discuss: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. They are the three major phases in the constitution of the psychic subject. The three major phases in the psychic structure. These terms used to describe the three elements of psychic structure, the triadic elements, and all three elements have an interplay in our psyche. Now we are coming into the real. That is the state of nature when a child is born. It doesn't know its own existence. When you enter the realm of language, you know your existence, or in the imaginary stage, in the mirror stage, you know your existence. But this is the stage before the language. It is the pre-mirror stage. The world of the infant as it exists before the mediation of language. Because it doesn't have any language, it is really complex. The child doesn't know woman carrying it is the mother. അമ്മയാണ് തന്നെ എടുത്തിരിക്കുന്നതെന്ന്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അമ്മ എന്നൊരു ടേം ഉണ്ടെന്ന് തന്നെ കുഞ്ഞിനറിയില്ല. അമ്മ എന്നൊരാളുണ്ടെന്ന് തന്നെ കുഞ്ഞിനറിയില്ല. കുഞ്ഞിന് ആ സമയത്ത് കരയുമ്പോൾ പാല് കിട്ടുകയാണെങ്കിൽ കുഞ്ഞ് ഹാപ്പിയാണ്. അതുകൊണ്ടല്ലേ നമ്മൾ ഹോസ്പിറ്റലിലൊക്കെ കുഞ്ഞുങ്ങൾ കരയുമ്പോൾ അമ്മയുടെ പാല് തന്നെ കൊടുക്കണം എന്നില്ല. അവർക്ക് ഫീഡിങ് ബോട്ടിലിൽ പാല് കൊടുത്താലും they are satisfied. And child doesn't know woman carrying it is the mother. Child doesn't know she is a woman. അതിന് ജെൻഡറിൻ്റെ കാര്യങ്ങളൊന്നും അറിയില്ല. Child doesn't know she is a woman. Child can't distinguish between himself and the other. അതൊന്നും അറിയില്ല. ലാംഗ്വേജിന് മുമ്പുള്ള സമയമാണ്. അതിന് ആ സമയത്ത് ആവശ്യമുള്ളത് അതിൻ്റെ നീഡ്സ് മാത്രമാണ്. അതിന് ആ സമയമുള്ളത് അല്ലേ? കുഞ്ഞുങ്ങൾക്ക് ആ സമയമുള്ളത് നീഡ്സ് മാത്രമാണ്. കരയുന്നു, പിന്നെ അതിൻ്റെ നാപ്പി നനയുമ്പോഴേക്കും അത് കരയണു, അതിന് അസ്വസ്ഥത ഉണ്ടാകുമ്പോൾ അതിന് കരയണു. എന്താ വേണ്ടത്, എന്താ ഉള്ളതെന്നൊന്നും അതിനറിയില്ല. പക്ഷേ അതിൻ്റെ നീഡ്സിനനുസരിച്ചിട്ടാണ് അതിൻ്റെ സൈക്കി അപ്പോൾ വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. And this real can never be truly engaged or grasped with because there is no language. Everything we understand through language only. Society is constructed through language only. But the stage, the real, exists before language. And this real cannot be understood. Real is completely lost. And it is mediated through the imaginary and the symbolic stage. That is what we are going to discuss now. The imaginary phase in the development of the child is the phase of imaginary oneness with the environment. The child doesn't know its existence. It feels a oneness with the environment because it doesn't have a perception of the self, is not introduced into the world of language, and it feels the imaginary oneness with the environment. During this phase, the child is not able to differentiate itself from the other. Child sees a oneness with the environment. It sees everything as an extension of its own body, and there is no sense of the self. And the child sees everything as an extension of its own body, there is no sense of the self, and this imaginary oneness breaks down during the mirror stage. When he sees its own reflection in the mirror, this imaginary oneness breaks down. And the child passes through the mirror stage between 6 months and 18 months. The imaginary stage. Here the child makes its first identification with the reflection in the mirror. And it is the starting off with stage, mirror stage. It now associates coordinated limbs and movements in the mirror with itself. And it forms a sense of self, a perception of self. I have described. In the imaginary stage, the child seeks to erase all difference and otherness by imagining himself as the person in the mirror and seeing himself and his mother as the same. It doesn't enter into the realm of language. And he identifies himself and the mother as the same. There is no division between himself and the mother. In Lacan's terms, the mirror stage is a homologue for the mother or child symbolic relation. That is, in the mirror stage also, child, even though it gets a perception of self, it doesn't differentiate himself from the mother. He sees himself and the mother as the same. He then describes the child as a signifier and the mirror image or the reflection is the signified. But whether the child can attain that signified? No, it cannot. Signified cannot be attained. Here the child looks into the mirror and says, "That's me," or it identifies or it smiles, and thereby giving himself some meaning. That's a sense of self, psychic response, mental I. And it smiles, it recognizes itself. And he thinks he can substitute himself with the mirror image, that he cannot identify that it is his reflection. It sees that image and itself as one. It cannot identify it's a reflection. And he thinks he can substitute itself with the mirror image. And the child here has a misrecognition that the image in the mirror is himself. A misrecognition happens here. And hence, the stage is metaphoric. That he thinks he can substitute itself with the mirror image. The substitution, it's a misrecognition that the child undergoes here. Hence, the stage is metaphoric as per Lacan. The imaginary stage is also pre-linguistic. Real stage is also pre-linguistic. Imaginary is also pre-linguistic. And here the child sees himself reflected in the mirror and considers himself as whole and complete and one with the mother. A sense of completeness he feels in the mirror, a completeness. The ideal I he sees in the mirror. The imaginary phase in the development of the child is the phase of imaginary oneness with the environment. During this phase, the child is not able to differentiate itself from the other. It could see the sense of self, but it is not able to differentiate itself from the other. And this imaginary oneness breaks during the mirror stage. A baby is born in the real stage. a baby is born, at the time of his birth, its life is driven only by needs, right? Baby only has needs at that time. He needs milk. He's hungry, he needs milk. And its life is driven only by needs. And it lives in unity with the mother. It doesn't know that it is a separate self. It's just living in unity with the mother. It doesn't know the existence of mother also, right? Existence of that particular person, mother. And it lives in unity with the mother, and its life is driven only by needs at this stage. And baby doesn't know it is separate from the mother. And he is a different being, he is a self, he is a subject. It doesn't know that. It doesn't know it is a unified self, doesn't know he is a separate self. And it lives in unity with the mother. But at some point in 6 and 8 months, in between 6 and 8 months, when it starts his image, when it starts to see his image, it occurs the mirror stage. In that mirror stage, the child sees his image in the mirror, and child understands it is separate from mother when he sees his image. But the child is incapable of realizing mirror image is different from self. Whether നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ നമ്മളുടെ കണ്ണാടിയിൽ നമ്മളെ തന്നെ കാണുമ്പോൾ ആ കണ്ണാടിയിലുള്ളത് ആള് നമ്മൾ തന്നെയാണോ? It is our reflection. It is not ourselves, it is our reflection. Child doesn't know it is only his reflection. The baby is incapable of understanding that it is only his reflection. Lacan defined mirror stage as one moment, that particular moment when he sees its image. But he understood it is an ongoing state. When around 6 months old, when it sees the mirror, it starts the mirror stage. Lacan proposes that human infants pass through a stage in which an external image of the body, that is his reflection in the mirror, produces a psychic response in the baby. When he sees his own reflection in the mirror, it produces a psychic response. And at that point, it gives rise to the mental representation of an I. When he sees his image, external image in the mirror, and it produces a psychic response in himself, and it gives rise to the representation, a mental representation of I. സെപ്പറേറ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള സെൽഫ് ആണ് എന്ന് ആ സമയത്താണ് കുഞ്ഞുങ്ങൾ റിയലൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നത് ഈ മിററിലെ ഇമേജ് കാണുമ്പോൾ. The infant identifies with the image. Infant could identify his image in the mirror. An image serves as a pattern of the infant's emerging perceptions of selfhood. He began to get a perception of himself. His reflection in the mirror serves as a pattern of the infant's emerging perception of selfhood. And in this stage, the child associates coordinated limbs and movements in the mirror. കുഞ്ഞ് മിററിലെ റിഫ്ലക്ഷൻ കാണുമ്പോൾ it could see the coordinated limbs and it could see the coordinated movements in the mirror. And thus it forms a sense of the self, a mental recognition. Earlier I told you, a psychic response, a perception of self, a mental representation of I emerges. This image in the mirror is established as an ideal I. Image which it sees in the mirror is the ideal I. That reflection is the ideal I. And To achieve this ideal I, the subject, the child, will strive throughout his or her life, and we are still continuing that process. To achieve that ideal I, which is perfect, the complete self, the reflection. Image is established as an ideal I, and towards that, the child will strive continuously throughout his life to attain that, to achieve that ideal I. According to Lacan, this quest can never be fulfilled. Nobody can reach that perfection of ideal I, the coordinated one, the sense of the complete self. This quest can never be fulfilled, and human existence is in essence a striving for a never attainable perfection. You can never attain the ideal I, which you see in the mirror. Image established as ideal I, and towards which the child will strive continuously to attain that ideal I. And according to Lacan, this quest never be fulfilled. For Lacan, mirror stage establishes the ego as fundamentally dependent upon external objects. In this mirror stage also, the ego, the conscious mind of the baby, is dependent upon the external objects, and this time also baby cannot distinguish himself from the mother. He sees or he understands the mother and the child as one. He has not entered the realm of language. He didn't started to think. Just believes is unified with mother. It's dependent upon the external objects. And the individual matures later or enters into the language, enters into the social relations. Then it starts to form its personality, understands the social relations, understands culture, enters into another order, enters into symbolic order, understands the society, understands the relations later. And when the child sees its own reflection in the mirror, it begins to conceive itself as being, as a self, which got coordinated movements of limbs. A conception of self happens at this time. A psychic response, a representation of mental I happens at this time in the mirror stage. Lacan's mirror stage is that when the subject is in love with its own image, when the child sees its own reflection in the mirror, and when it sees its own reflection, its own body in the mirror, and actually it precedes the love of others. It began to love itself, and it also precedes the love of others. കുഞ്ഞുങ്ങൾക്ക് എപ്പോഴും മിറർ കാണുമ്പോൾ, കൊച്ചു കുട്ടികൾ ആദ്യമേ കുഞ്ഞുങ്ങൾ ആദ്യം മിറർ കാണുമ്പോൾ അവർക്ക് ഭയങ്കര കൗതുകമാണ് അല്ലേ. അവരവരുടെ സെൽഫ് തന്നെ മിററിൽ കാണുമ്പോൾ അവരെ തന്നെ മനസ്സിലാക്കുകയാണ്. അവരുടെ ഒരു സെൽഫ് വിത്ത് ഓൾ ദി ഹാൻഡ്സ്, വിത്ത് ദ ലെഗ്സ്, യൂണിഫൈഡ് സെൽഫ് അവർ മിററിൽ അവരെ തന്നെ ഐഡൻറ്റിഫൈ ചെയ്യുകയാണ്. The infant identifies with its image in the mirror. For Lacan, ego emerges, the mental representation of I at this moment, in this fascination with its own image. Ego is both formed by in the organizing properties of this image. Ego is both formed by and takes its form from the organizing and constituting properties of the image. That is, a mental representation of I is formed. I, the ego, conscious mind. It is entering into the conscious mind, conscious world, getting a picture of self. Lacan insists that ego, the mental representation of I, is based on an illusory image of the wholeness. I told you, ideal I, the complete self, he see in the image. The child understands himself with the coordinated movements of limbs, but it's still fragmented. It is still dependent. It is still fragmented. As a child in the mirror stage cannot wholly gain mastery and control over its body, the child doesn't have the control over its body because it is dependent. It has the coordinated movements of limbs. It got a sense of bodily anatomy from the mirror, from the image, but it is still fragmented because he doesn't have the full control over its body. And it is the function of the ego there to maintain the illusion of coherence and mastery. Ego, the self, it's the function of self to maintain this illusion of coherence, the unified self, the mental representation of I. That happens in this mirror stage. That is a much more elaboration of the ideal I, the mental representation of the self. As the sense of unity the child sees in the mirror face is an illusion. The sense of unified self in the reflection is just an illusion because the child cannot attain that unified self. There is a fundamental disharmony regarding the ego. Ego is essentially that starts the conflict. Ego is essentially a terrain of conflict and discord that starts a continual struggle in ego. With the mirror stage, child attains the first realizations of its bodily autonomy. When the child sees its image in the mirror, it attains the first realization of its bodily autonomy. It finds, it identifies its hands, legs, its limbs, and it begins the lifelong process of identifying the self in terms of the other. It starts to identify the self in terms of the other. It starts to differentiate himself from the other. It starts to differentiate himself from the world around him. He began to analyze its existence. See the picture of the babies. They're really fascinated to see their own image in the mirror. They are very much fascinated. See, when they smile, they could see their own image and smiling back. They could see their movements, hand movements. They frequently touch the image and they could analyze how their bodily movements are happening. Isn't that interesting? During the mirror stage, the child for the first time becomes aware through seeing its image in the mirror that his or her body as a total form. Infant can also govern the movements of this image through the movements of its own body and thus experiences a pleasure. Infant moves his hand, then it could see the image also moves its hand and it experiences a pleasure. It analyzes itself. Slowly, it gets a perception of self. This sense of completeness and mastery, however, is in contrast to the child's experience of its own body, over which doesn't have yet full motor control. This sense of completeness, when he sees its image in the mirror, that the movements that he makes, that is also repeated in the image, and this sense of completeness or mastery over its image, but it cannot experience it as in its body because it is fragmented. It feels a fragmented self, fragmented feeling, it gets a fragmented feeling because it doesn't have a full motor control. Child cannot control itself at this time also. The infant feels his or her body to be in parts, as fragmented but not yet unified. Image provides him or her with a sense of unification and wholeness. Image provides a unification or wholeness. കുഞ്ഞിൻ്റെ ബോഡി അവസ്ഥകളെ കൺട്രോൾ ചെയ്യാനുള്ളൊരു പാകം ആ സമയത്തില്ല. പക്ഷേ ആ ഒരു യൂണിഫിക്കേഷനും ആ ഒരു ഹോൾനെസ്സും ഇമേജിൽ നിന്ന് കുട്ടിക്ക് കിട്ടുന്നു. The mirror image therefore anticipates the mastery of the infant's own body and stands in contrast to the feelings of fragmentation the infant experiences. This mirror image, it is very crucial because it anticipates the mastery of the infant's own body. Infant could master his body after some time, and this mirror image anticipates this mastery, and it stands in contrast to the feelings of fragmentation. The self gets fragmented because it couldn't control itself, but in the mirror image, it could see a wholeness because it could experience its own body. It could see a completeness because the child could govern the movements in the image through its own movements. And the mirror image stands in contrast to the feelings of fragmentation that the infant experiences. What is important at this point is that infant identifies with this mirror image. Infant identifies with the mirror image. Infant gets a perception of self. That image is himself or herself. The child gets that perception of self. It could see its body. Then it gets into the conscious world. And this identification is very much important. Without this identification, the infant would never get to the stage of perceiving himself as a complete being. But at the same time, image is alienating in the sense that it becomes confused with the self. The image actually comes to take the place of the self, that identifying the self with that image. And therefore, you can say the sense of the unified self in the psyche is acquired at the price of this self being another. That is our mirror image. യൂണിഫൈഡ് സെൽഫിൻ്റെ ഒരു സെൻസ് അതിൻ്റെ സൈക്കിയിലാണ് ഉണ്ടാവുന്നത്, മെൻ്റൽ റിപ്രസെൻറ്റേഷൻ ഓഫ് ഐ. യൂണിഫൈഡ് സെൽഫിൻ്റെ ഒരു സെൻസ് അതിൻ്റെ മെൻ്റൽ റിപ്രസെൻറ്റേഷനിലാണ് ഉണ്ടാവുന്നത്, സൈക്കിയിലാണ് ഉണ്ടാവുന്നത് ഒരു യൂണിഫൈഡ് സെൽഫ്. അതെങ്ങനെയാണ് കുഞ്ഞിന് മനസ്സിലാവുന്നത്? when it sees its own image as other in the mirror. It sees itself as another, that is the mirror image itself. Next stage is symbolic. This is a stage when the child acquires language, is introduced in the world of language, and it is an important formulation in Lakhan. It is the realm of language. It is the realm of symbolization. Child acquires language at this stage. It is the moment in which child enters the society, social relations. It enters in the realm of family, society, father, mother, brother, sister. Child discovers that the society has different names for father, mother, and child. Different beings is introduced into the world of culture, world of relations. Father, authoritative figure, mother, child, and she is mother in language. In the language, the child is realizing mother, the woman who is associated with himself as the mother and is different from its self. Child began to identify this. And child discovers here an endless chain of signifiers. Child is, child is understanding I, mother, father, all these signifiers. And he discovers social relations. He is introduced into the culture. The child discovers that he is different from others and that he cannot desire the mother. Mother is separate from him. Mother is really a different self. Mother is the other. And he is a different self. He discovers the symbolic order that is external to himself, what Lacan terms the other. The symbolic order, he identifies the other. Thus, the desire of the mother is now prohibited by the order or the name of the father, the oneness with the mother. It breaks here. And it is prohibited by the order or the name of the father. He cannot desire the mother. There is a name of the father even when the father is not necessarily present. He is introduced into the world of culture. There is a father named a figure, father. Even though father is not necessarily present, there is a figure of father, name. And in the symbolic stage, the absence of the mother the child feels because the child cannot have her or possess her. She is different. Child breaks her oneness with the mother. She is different but will be always desired because of her absence. And the absence of the mother is linked to the absence of the father who is present only as a name. See, usually we hear a statement like this. If a child does any wrong, the mother will say, I'll tell your father. And here, the absent father acquires a threatening presence because of the name of the father, the authoritarian figure. In the symbolic, therefore, the absence of the mother, because child cannot have mother, is linked to the absence of the father, who is present only as a name, who is present as a threatening presence. There are thus two absences. In the case of the mother, desire of the absent mother by the child, and in the case of the father, the threat of the father in the very name father. Lacan here is working with the language of the symbolic order, where mother stands for the desire of the absent mother and father stands for the threat of the absent. Both language and absence go together here. Language as constituting a social bond in the symbolic. Language is more important. Through language, child gets introduced to the social realms, to the society, to the culture, mother, father, desire for the mother, the threatening presence of the father. He is getting introduced. The child acquires language and begins to understand the difference, the social relations, that he is not one with the mother, he cannot possess mother, or the primary desire of the mother, and that the law of the father is supreme, the authoritarian figure. The symbolic order is the realm of language or symbolization. The child acquires language. It is in the world of signifiers. It's a linguistic phase, and therefore it is the domain of culture. The child gets introduced into culture through language. Mother, father, the relations, social relations. So the mirror stage also marks the beginning of a transition from the imaginary or pre-linguistic stage. In the pre-linguistic stage, child doesn't recognize itself from others. And it is a transition from imaginary to the symbolic stage of language acquisition. Imaginary stage, self is a unified whole, oneness with the environment, and then it is fragmented and it is mediated by the differences in the mirror stage. Then, on the realization of the imminent presence of the other, the self is divided in the mirror stage and it breaks down the comforting imaginary condition, and the child enters into the symbolic order of social roles, gender differences, world of subjects, objects, and the world of language. So, real, the first stage, the pre-linguistic stage, imaginary stage, inside it, mirror stage. In the mirror stage, after that, the symbolic stage. The main three orders, that is real, imaginary, and symbolic, and inside imaginary it comes the mirror stage. So now we are winding up the discussion of Lacan here. We'll start with another topic in our next class. Thank you.